Hi, friends. It's Joe. I'm back here with Colin McIntyre, the creator of Covenant Cards. Welcome, Colin.
Hey, everybody. Good to see you, Joe, and looking forward to this session about, celestial objects and things in the sky. Yeah.
Yeah, me too. I'm excited about this, and especially as it relates to other things we're going to talk about in the future. I'm just chafing at the bit to talk about some stuff. The more I go through my Facebook timeline with all the end times hysteria, last days kookiness, every time something pops up, with Bill Gates, 5G, blood moons, the mark of the beast, vaccines, all of that stuff. And the Antichrist. I think there's going to be so much that I'm really looking forward to kind of a knockdown, drag out episode about those topics. And really, because I love the people that are sharing those things, but as far as those topics go and that doomsday stuff, I'm really looking forward to giving it a broken nose, two black eyes, and just grinding it to pieces, so that's how I feel about it. Yeah, and that's the toned down version.
I hate to see you in a real fight, man. Yeah.
Well, I'm a man at peace, but when it comes to things that are really destroying people and messing with their psyche and bringing hopelessness, I hate those things. I really have a holy hatred for them, especially when there are things that used to have me bound and things that I used to propagate for years in my preaching and teaching, and that really didn't help people whatsoever. So yeah, when something had you bound and you're free, free people want to free people. I really believe that. So yeah. So moving along in Matthew 24, verse 29. And for those who are watching via YouTube or the JesusConversation.org, this is part 6. I said it was part 6 last week, but it was actually 5.5 because we got carried away. So this is now part 6 of our Matthew 24 Fulfilled series, which is included in a larger project called Debunking Last Days Hysteria. And that project can be heard in its entirety on the Love Reimagined podcast. So without further ado, we are going to dig into Matthew chapter 24, verse 29 through, we think, 31. So we'll start this out and see what happens. I'm going to go ahead and read that verse, and then we'll kind of take it from there. Okay, immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. So, Colin, is this something do I need to be looking up in the sky? Should people, be looking at sun, moon, and stars and the planets and worrying about this entire solar system, at least, coming to an immediate end imminently?
Well, thank God there's no need for us to be chicken littles. The sky is falling, the sky is falling. And there's, like you said, there's a lot of solace that we can get from a really investigative approach to the history and the context of these verses. And so I feel like there's two ways that you could get a hold of verse 29. One way would be a more literal implication of it in its historical context. And then the other one would be a more figurative way, a symbolic way that these words are used across the Old Testament and up to that day in the New Testament. So I guess the literal way would be to look at it as when Jerusalem, the holy house, Josephus says in his War of the Jews, when the holy house was on fire, everything was plundered that came to hand, and 10,000 of those that were caught, they were slain. It talks about the flame was carried a long way and made an echo. Even, it was a conflagration that was so violent, the fire, that it made an echo around the valley and the mountains of Jerusalem, together with the groans of those that were slain. And because this hill was high, he says, and the works at the temple were very great, one would have thought that the whole city had been on fire, because the Temple Mount was the dominant position on the city. And he uses a lot of extreme words in this description of the last stand of that temple, and when it was burning there. No one could imagine anything greater or more terrible than this noise. The Roman legions were shouting, marching all together. There was a sad clamor of the seditious, that is the betrayers, who were now surrounded with fire and sword, the zealots. And then at the end here it says, yet was the misery itself more terrible than this disorder. For one would have thought that the hill itself on which the temple stood was seething hot, as full of fire on every part of it, that the blood was larger in quantity than the fire. Imagine that. And those that were slain more in number than those that slew them. And so, this is just, in so many words, just one of the most distressing, violent portrayals of the siege, the last stages of the siege of Jerusalem, that has ever been recorded, And so you can imagine what happens when a city is on fire like that, that the smoke rising up into the sky would result into something resembling a red moon, or a blotted out moon, the hazy sun, the smoke and the fire would have basically veiled the sky and caused this grotesque kind of very morbid kind of setting, which could have been spoken of poetically, like the moon will not give her light, the sun will be darkened, the stars fall from the sky, and so on. But I don't think that is the real intention of this verse. I think the real point of the words that are used here is in a more symbolic way,
Sure.
A way that was used in prophecy a lot up to that time. And again, these words are to be taken together in parallel, or in as a kind of package, not to pick each word out, sun and then moon and then stars and then powers, stars falling, and try to tag some kind of individual meaning to each one. But as usual in Hebraic poetry and Hebraic lingo, you might say, they're meant to be taken in parallel. There are parallelisms, each one reinforcing the other, almost like synonyms do in the English language. So when you read one and then the next and the next, it takes on an emphasis that kind of adds to the whole thing.
Sure, because if these things were literal and not figurative, according to the language that's used in the Old Testament, all of it would have been destroyed. There would be no solar system even before Jesus got on the scene. He wouldn't even have had time to get on the scene if all these things are literal, and we're supposed to take them literally when we read our Bibles, which we are not supposed to. So just a brief interjection there, but sure, go on.
And I mean, yeah, so we don't have to, every time Halley's Comet or some other asteroid or whatever cosmological object appears, or it's in the newspaper, in the news, NASA reports something, we don't have to automatically try to tether that, natural phenomenon to something in Scripture, because in these cases, Scripture is talking about something quite different than physical phenomena.
But it's a free pass. It's a free pass for anyone who wants to write a book or has this doomsday prediction. Those aren't the ones being called false prophets. They get a pass because people are so brainwashed with futurism, Darbyism, just a crazy doomsday eschatology. So it really is time to call those things out in love and say, hey, that's not how it is. And there is a more excellent way, a more excellent understanding. Yeah. And here's what we believe the truth is.
I agree with you. It's very profitable market, very prophetic signs, and tying it to these kinds of things that happen in nature quite often, because the great thing for that kind of enterprise is that they come around every few decades or every few years even. And so there's basically an unlimited potential for drawing links and connections and parallels between these things and Scripture in the Bible. So just like Joe says, why don't we just wash that out of our minds right now and go and look at what these signs in the sky, the sun, moon, and stars, meant from the very, very beginning. So if you have your Bible, you want to go to Genesis 1. Surprise, surprise. The first mention of sun, moon, and stars is where we actually get the meaning that would color it from then on in the Old Testament. And this is something called the law of first mention. It's a principle that I think is useful, and I haven't yet seen it fail, although, I'm not an expert on it, but the idea then is that when you want to find the meaning of something, especially something symbolic in the Bible, like a number, you know what I mean? Or an object or a prophetic object like this, then you want to go where it's first mentioned and derive clues from there, dig up some clues around it from that where it's first mentioned. This is also, in a different way, is useful for discovering when the Hebrews wrote about a person, the first words of that person are generally used in Middle East, Near Eastern storytelling. The first words of that character kind of comprise the sum of the personality of that character. And so you can investigate this on your own. Go and look at the first words of someone like Joseph or Esau or David or even Jesus or John the Baptist. Some groups and I have done this together, and it's fascinating what you can dig up. If you look at the very first recorded words, not actions, but recorded words of those people, it can give you an amazing clue into their destiny, into their purpose, into their character, and so on.
Even in their names before they could utter a word, Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and of course, the names is even more, I think, telling. Yeah, you're right. And so, but let's get off that rabbit trail and come back to the topic, man, which is.
But I like rabbit trails. No,
lights in the heavens.
You started it. Okay.
Lights in the heavens. So Genesis 1, verse 14 is very famous. I probably hardly have to read it, but just for completeness sake. And God said, "Let there be lights in the vault of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and they shall be signs for the fixed times and for days and years. And they shall be lights in the vault of the heavens to light up the earth." And so it was. Verse 16, and God made the two great lights. And as an aside, we know what that means, the sun and the moon. The great light, or the big light, for dominion of day, the sun, and the small light, the moon, for dominion of night. And he tags on the end, and the stars. And so there we have it. We have the three celestial objects that Matthew mentions, or in the law of first mention, are here in Genesis. And so from these verses, we can see that there are two, I guess, overarching purposes for why God created these lights in the heavens. And if you read it, you can try to bring them out. See if you can find it yourself. If you want to pause this, but I'm just going to continue. The first one is that they are going to be what? Signs. And they're going to be signs that are marked for fixed times. Now, this is we could do a whole podcast just on that. I mean, if you think of the signs that are in the Bible, for example, the sign that accompanied Jesus' birth, that's a fascinating study. It's not, like we have little kids holding the Star of David and parading, leading the wise men directly to, where Jesus as a baby lay. It's much, much more plausible scientifically than that. If you look at the arrangement of the cosmos during Jesus' birth, that is, tracking the constellations that were in play, scientists now have the ability to reverse the stars in the heavens and go all the way back to any date they want in the past, just because of the physical constants that there are in the universe. They can do that with great accuracy. And they've discovered things about, the stars that appeared and the planets that aligned around Jesus' birth are very, very telling about a monarch and about the Messiah that would appear. So, that's one example of signs that are meant for fixed times and for days and years. And it's interesting that God uses the definite article, the fixed times here. In other words, it does seem to me that he had, like a chess master, he had these moves planned out, you know what I mean, from the beginning of creation. And so when the stars and constellations or whatever aligned, that different things were going to happen.
And
And
that's with perfect infinite foreknowledge and factoring in all of man's screw ups. And he just
yeah,
knows, you know, and hey,
yeah,
this is what's going to happen then. And so he has always, he's never turned his back on mankind. He has always been with us, always loving us. And it's just a matter of, hey, there's things, if you're listening, there's things in your now, there's things a nanosecond from now. Holy Spirit has already been there. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit have already done it. This is a back to the future kind of thing. God ended the whole thing before he ever started it, if you really look at it in the grand scheme of things. So we just get to walk out in the Spirit what Father already knows, what he's already provided for. And so even to where these, you know, different signs in the heavens, right down to just everything that's happening, not that God brings evil, but he works all things together for good, even in the midst of something like COVID-19. So it doesn't take Father by surprise, and he's going to see us through. He loves us deeply. He's seeing us through this, and I'm very encouraged about that. You know, he knows.
yeah. And just to even clarify that more, you know, we don't believe in deism. We're not deists, where God just wound up the universe when he created it and let it go like an infinitely complex clockwork machine. That we're not fatalistic in that way. And that we're also not saying that God is not intimately invested in the universe. He just lets things go and just lets things happen as they go.
He factored in this perichoresis, this divine dance, you know,
Yeah.
man functioning in union with him. Our participation is factored in, and things like prayer, all of that matters, you know, but
Mhm.
he knows it's going to happen before it did, I believe. And that's
Yeah.
kind of a really awesome thing to think about. And if I could fully understand it, I'd be
Yeah.
him, and I'm not. Yeah. So
Yeah. And maybe Paul was the closest. You know, he says to the complete, you know, clueless pagans, the Gentiles, in him we live and move and have our being. And
yeah.
that's how he sums up all of these. You know, what Paul was preaching was, it's God that set the boundaries of men and the times and the seasons, and now he
Yeah.
set it up so that Jesus would come. And this, he talks about the resurrection, and so now all men need to hear this message and repent. So yeah, so he goes on, and in Genesis 1, now we have two purposes, as we said, for these lights. One of them is for fixed times, for days and years, and to light up the earth. I guess there's three now that I look at it again. The second one would be to light up the earth, yeah, like to make the plants grow and everything like that. But and you know, that has a spiritual significance too, right? Because this is just coming to me right now. Like to light up the earth with these things brings to mind Jesus saying, "I am the light of the world." And then another place he says, "You are the light of the world. And a city set on a hill cannot be hid." You know, nobody hides a lamp under a bushel basket, but they
Yeah.
use it to light up the house, and a city lights up all the nation, you know, the regions surrounding it, and so on. And so are we, and so is God. So
I'm so thankful that the Lord uses natural things to explain spiritual things. You know, he
mm,
always has, because because we can relate, mankind can relate to the visible realm, and there's always a parallel in the invisible realm. And that has always really just touched me and helped me. You know, I believe when you really, you know, when you really have a beautiful revelation of the Creator, you can just look at a flower and be in absolute awe, you know,
right, yeah,
because he upholds all things by the word of his power, even every single that flower on us at a cellular level, you know, all the way from seed to, you know,
yeah,
to its blooming. So yeah, that's us too, you know, sure.
yeah. I mean, that's why they call it the miracle of creation. To us, it's miraculous and inexplicable, but to God, it's like, yeah, this is my everyday life. You know, this is what I do. That's how I roll. You know, so
Yeah, yeah,
so the third meaning that you can derive from Genesis 1 is God made the two great lights and the great light was for, and here's the word, dominion of day. And then the small light, which is ostensibly the moon, for dominion of night, and then the stars also. And so here we have the third great theme, which is dominion, that, or rulership, or governmental authority, power in that sense, to lead. And so you can see this theme especially track all the way through Genesis. And so you might remember Joseph. This is one of the next instances of these lights in the sky. When Joseph had his dream, and he saw, of course, about the agricultural, the corns of wheat, the grains of who were bowing down to him, sheaves, I guess it was. But then the dream after that, and this is where even his dad got mad, I think, Jacob, right?
Sure.
Because, or not, maybe not mad, but maybe annoyed or irritated, because this young whelp, you might say, was using the sun, moon, and stars to in a metaphorical way about authority. And so you have his brothers, were some of those celestial objects, and those celestial objects were bowing down to his great celestial object. And
Yes.
and even the sun and moon, which is like his dad and mom.
Yep.
And so so Joseph's dream is just another instance of this path that you can see of dominion being, or rather sun, moon, and stars being representative of governmental authority. Now the prophets take up this track and use it quite a bit. And there's various nations that are prophesied about. I'm just reading through my list here. Zion is one in Joel. Edom is another in Amos. And I guess I might as well read just some of these so you get the flavor of how the prophets talked about it. Sure. In Joel 2:10, talking about Zion, he says, "Before it the earth shudders, the heavens shake, sun and moon go dark, and stars their radiance withdraw." So as you said, these are not actual literal sun, moon, and stars. Otherwise, we'd all be dead, floating in the cold galaxy. But these are talking about, as far as wicked nations are concerned, it's lights out for them. And I had the idea of knocking your lights out, putting your lights out, which means like you're just shut off. You're deactivated. You know what I mean? You're no longer around. You're no longer conscious in order to put one foot in front of the other. In other words, these nations are toast.
Sure.
And their influence, their light, you might say. Like when we talk about stars, we talk about like American Idol, something like a superstar or a person who sells a lot of albums or whatever, or is a movie star. And if their star winks out, well, even in English, we know what that means. They might have gotten into some personal trouble, and their reputation or whatever went down. And so the same thing with these nations. So Joel, in another part, speaks something very similar to Matthew again. He says, "I will set portents in the heavens and on earth, blood and fire and columns of smoke," which that's a bit tied to the literal meaning we talked about, Jerusalem temple burning. Yes. There.
Which Peter brings up in Acts chapter 2. He talks about the same thing there.
Yeah. Right. He quotes Joel in
exactly.
Yeah. "The sun shall turn into darkness and the moon into blood before the coming of the day of Yahweh, great and fearful." Here's another one from Amos regarding Edom, which was Herod the Great's, I think, mom. I can't remember his mom or his dad. They were Edomites, and the Idumeans we talked about also recently, who invaded Jerusalem and caused havoc there. "It shall happen on that day, said Yahweh, I will make the sun set at noon and darken the earth on a day of light." Now, turning to Babylon, Isaiah pipes up and says, "Look, Yahweh's day comes, ruthlessly, anger and smoldering wrath, to turn the earth into desolation and expunge its offenses from it. For the stars in the heavens and their constellations shall not shine with their light. The sun shall go dark when it rises, and the moon shall not send forth its light." So you can see the triumvirate, the Trinity, sun, moon, and stars are used in parallel to talk about a nation's downfall. What else can you say?
Sure.
Um, Now, this one will probably attach to, because later in Matthew, it talks about the fig tree. Some of you guys might remember.
Hmm.
Isaiah 34, this is now about all nations, presumably all surrounding nations, which was usually the case. Probably not literally every single nationality on planet Earth, but those in its context Isaiah is talking about. It says, heaven shall roll up like a scroll, and all the stars shall fall like what? Like leaves from a
Hmm.
vine. Interesting. And as leaves fall from a fig tree. So there is one of the first mentions of fig tree leaves and vines now being used in tandem with this heaven, stars, sun, and moon kind of idea,
Sure.
which which is about, you might think of the fig tree as the lifeblood of the nation, and the stars, sun, and moon would be the governmental authority or the influence or power or prestige or something like that of the nation.
Hmm.
So before we go into Luke, anything you want to add there, Joe?
Well, just a couple of things, just go over those scriptures if people want to just kind of write them down. But
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
Matthew 24:29, Genesis 37:9, and you mentioned from Genesis 1, Acts 2:16 through 21. And then when you're talking about the use of these terms, this apocalyptic language in the old covenant, where the sun, moon, and stars actually didn't just totally black out, because yeah, they're around today, so they didn't fall, prior to Christ or now. They're still here, and they will, yeah, remain. But some of those, you can look at Jeremiah 4:23 through 26, Ezekiel 32:7 through 9, Isaiah 13:9 through 13, Isaiah 34, 4 through 5 will give you kind of a good grasp on that for starters. Did want to say this too, and in my studies, and according to the Hebrew, the Midrash, the ancient Judaic commentary on the Hebrew scriptures, to them the sun represented the king, the moon represented the Sanhedrin, and the stars represented rabbis. So just kind of wanted to throw that in there when he's talking about the overthrow of authorities, just like authorities were represented by Joseph's, his parents, the sun and moon, and then the stars being the brothers. So there's this Jesus that Joseph really was a type and a shadow of, rising up above the systems,
Okay.
this lowly one, this meek and lowly one, kind of rising up to power. Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't heard that before from the Midrash. So
Hmm.
is that before or after Jesus? I'm curious to find out, actually. Yeah.
This was, I'll have to look at the date, but it's
Yeah.
it's a covenant eschatology commentary, and I'll have to get the exact source for you. But I did,
Sure.
it was something that I took note of there, and yeah, would
That's
yeah,
cool. Yeah.
it merits further study. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. And that brings to mind something that some of our viewers or listeners might have picked up in Revelation chapter 12. When it talks about the tail of the serpent, bringing down a third of the stars and so on. Well,
Yeah.
as we've seen here already, that doesn't necessarily have to signify angels, like as in seraphim, cherubim, or celestial beings per se. Even though the ancients did theorize that angels lived on stars, like that's where angels came from or whatever. I think in a Hebrew context, that is not the best explanation for me. Anyways, this is my opinion, and anybody out there that wants to correct me is fine. But for me, what I saw is something from Abraham's visions when God brought him outside and asked him to look up into the sky and count the stars, and another time count the sand of the seashore. He was talking about his descendants, and I think the idea there is not just quantity, though I could be wrong, but it could be God is inferring a quality, that there is your descendants are not just going to be as numerous as the stars, but they're going to be like stars. In other words, because remember, he say kings and queens shall come from you. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
That as governmental authority, leaders are going to come from your, from your I don't want to say the word, but I have to. Loins. Loins. Yeah, there you go. So,
Well,
it's
I'm
gonna,
worse. I've introduced my grown sons, my adult sons, to people as the fruit of my loins. So yeah, kids love that one. Yeah.
okay, let's use seed. Okay, your seed will be great upon the earth, and so on. Okay, blah blah blah. So, I mean, the idea there that really got or struck me was that when it talks about the third of the stars being swept from the sky, could this not, in a Hebrew context, be talking about the leaders being corrupted? I definitely see that as an option. Like if the serpent wants to deceive people and corrupt people, then it would make sense that that prophetic symbolism, could be used in order to not always. It doesn't always have to be supernatural, spiritual, but it can be talking about human beings who have a destiny and a purpose as children of Abraham, who are now being tricked or cheated out of that purpose and becoming earthly. Because isn't that what the serpent did? He brought the stars down to earth, and that brings to mind that whole dichotomy that Paul brings out in Corinthians about earthly, beastly, fleshly kind of people who act in that way, and
Mm-hmm.
spiritual, star-like, supernatural people. They call it pneumatikos people, pneuma, which means spirit, and and so on. And so there's just ways to walk in this life. One is by the flesh in an earthly way. One is by the heavenly way, the spiritual way, about walking by the Spirit. And so,
And what
you
you're
know,
saying, falls in line with the way that I read Revelation. I see it as a huge indictment against empire, the Roman Empire in particular, but things that we can learn from it today, as well as admonition and encouragement for believers. And we have this victorious king, and then we have, I believe that the end of the book, you're looking at chapters 21, 22, we're still that is still being manifested, that thing, that it's still growing, of the increase of his kingdom, of his government, his kingdom and peace. There'll be no end. And that really blesses me when I read the book of Revelation. But I see it as mainly historical. And let's say there's so much figurative language, whether you're talking about, stars, sun, moon, anything like that. Even, is Jesus, does he have a big tattoo on his thigh? Is he a lamb? Is he a lion? Does he really have a sword coming out of his mouth? There's so much, stuff there. And if you don't read it figuratively, if you're a literalist, you're going to, I'd challenge you to make a two list through the book of Revelation. One side, what you believe is literal, the other side, what's figurative, and then tell me why. And I think you're going to have a hard time reasoning that out. I'd like to hear the rationale behind that. So I think when we learn what these deeper things mean and what they meant to the ancient audience, to the the original audience there in the first century, I believe that it helps us, and then it helps us to put our present and future into perspective without all the fear mongering and that type of thing. So when people understand this, when we're talking about this, about sun, moon, and stars, it's like, okay, that's what that means. That's what it meant to a first century Jew who heard that. So I don't have to be afraid. I can look forward to a glorious church. I can look forward to the sons of God being manifested in the earth like never before. His kingdom coming, his will being done on earth as in heaven. I can be a blessed peacemaker, and it's going to make a difference on this planet. I don't have to be looking at wars and rumors of wars and such that were prophesied to happen in the first century and did happen. So yeah.
Right on. Yeah. And I mean, just to keep going on that same theme, Revelation chapter 12, and I guess we might say, Joe, that it's not just about the Roman Empire, but it could even be not just including, but the thrust of it could be, covenant Israel also. Because, I mean, if you see Revelation chapter 12, a great sign appeared in heaven. Remember the woman clothed with the sun. Well, what does that mean?
Sure.
The woman was it had the moon under her feet and then the crown of 12 stars on her head.
Sure.
And that sounds a lot like Joseph's dream to me also, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
the 12 sons of Jacob
But
are
it's
the
really talking about, you're looking at political and religious authority, basically, is what I'm, getting to there, and in that
yeah,
day. So yeah, when you're talking about the whore of Babylon and all of that we can get into, and the city that's called Sodom and Egypt and that type of thing, it is a
yeah,
huge indictment against Old Covenant Israel, but as well, I believe too, the Roman Empire is involved in that, and I think there's lessons that there's primary meaning to a thing, and then there's applications that are just something that we can look at in our day and say, hey, there's there's some things here that we can learn from,
yeah.
so yeah.
And I mean, I really like that prophetic imagery that John writes there in his apocalypse, because then we don't have to mess around with replacement theology and say, Israel is like this monolith. No, what we're saying is that this woman, let's call her Israel, or like kind of like Sarah was a picture, like Sarah versus Hagar almost, but Sarah is now wanting to give birth. It says in Revelation chapter 12 verse 2, and she's pregnant, she's crying out in agony. And so this great history, this lineage of Israel is now wanting to give birth to something new. But there's another voice in the scene, and that dragon, that serpent, wants to deceive the authorities of the stars, you might say, of this, that have come from this woman already. And it's kind of using parts of the woman against herself. So what Israel wants to birth is, of course, the new covenant and Jesus Christ, the Messiah, and the kingdom that he's going to bring. But there are other forces at work here that want to bring that down. And then he talks later about her children then coming out and warring against the serpent, along with angels and so on. So it's fascinating stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
It does really fit well with the history of the church,
Yeah. And I look at it and I just see the first century all the way
Yeah.
through it. And again, an indictment against, against Old Covenant Israel, which really the end was near at that point, but also their beginning was there too, because their consummate fulfillment, the Lord Jesus Christ, the perfect Israel, formed this commonwealth of Israel, and it's been growing ever since. So, what a beautiful thing. And you mentioned about, replacement theology. Well, no, to me, God never paused or ended. He never paused or substituted anything for Israel. What he did was really broaden the definition of Israel.
Right.
He redefined it and
Amen.
expanded it through the Lord Jesus Christ. Because again, and I've said this before, the first church was distinctly Jewish in so many ways. Your original apostles and your church was distinctly Jewish, and so this wasn't a replacement. God, what kind of a God would put Jews, okay, on pause for over 2,000 years, okay,
Mm.
and say, no, you can't partake of this. Here's your king, but you can't partake of this, and this is for another day for you. And like I say, I could get into that, from converts from different places who weren't even Semitic people at times. And we've just got so many crazy things that are going on, in the world today. And the things that people believe happened in 1948 with the geopolitical construct of the nation of Israel versus what, our Father calls the Commonwealth of Israel that Paul referred to. And so kind of, getting ahead of myself there. These are some things that I really want to talk about in the future, because they are near and dear to my heart, and they have
Yeah.
so much to do with world peace and the decisions that governments are making. And really, American evangelicals, especially because of all this futurism and dispensationalist, Darbyist thinking, it has influenced so much that happens in the world, and there are precious people being killed, being displaced, being totally ravaged, living under apartheid because of this prevailing mindset that really
Mm.
needs to go. And I will talk about that in the future. But to me, C.I. Schofield was an absolute scoundrel. And I'll talk about that more in the future. Yeah.
Yeah, I love how you explain that, the expansion of Israel and not in being limited in any way. I think that needs to be, spoken of more, because sometimes we fight over trivialities about that. We fight over the wrong things, let's say. Yeah.
No,
So
it's the one who are really doing the replacement theology is the dispensationalists, because they've replaced Israel, which again started out predominantly Jewish, okay, the church, but they go ahead and they say, well, Israel ended, and then all of a sudden you got the church, and then we put them on pause all this time, and then there's folks that
yeah,
think all of these people are just going to suffer in eternal conscious torment, and God, I mean, that's not, it's crazy. The thinking is really crazy. God did not, pause Israel. This is an
mm,
ongoing thing that was in the heart of God. And when you look at the continuity of the story of Israel, Jesus didn't end it. He totally fulfilled it and is fulfilling it, through his people and through Abraham's seed, which he is Abraham's seed. And if we are Christ, we are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. And he's the father of nations, of every ethnos. And
mm.
that is of utmost importance. Yeah. So I could go on for a long time about that, but I'm very, very passionate about that.
So we've taken the wide view, the very broad view of sun, moon, and stars here, and but now we want to narrow it down, focus it, if you will, and we want to look at Luke here, because Luke, as we know, parallels Matthew in the Olivet Discourse, in this apocalyptic prophecy that Jesus, tells about the future. And so here's Luke chiming in chapter 21 and verse 11 at the tail end. He now talks about, he brings another phrase into play here, which is terrible portents and great signs in the sky. And also in verse 25, there will be signs in sun and moon and stars, and on the earth the distress of nations, in bewilderment at the roar of sea and surf, while men faint away from fear and anticipation of the things coming upon the inhabited world, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And that echoes Matthew, of course. But this terrible portents and great signs in the sky, this goes back to, what Genesis 1 told us. The very first thematic meaning for sun, moon, stars is that it would be for fixed times and seasons. That is, a phenomenon would happen in the sky that would give you a kind of a red X on your calendar. You know what I mean? Like when you want to mark your calendar to remember something important. Well, Jesus, God, has the entire cosmos as his ally, as his writing tool, you might say. And so, and that's true. People in antiquity expected cosmic signs before events, important events, especially catastrophic events. I read a little Chinese history, and whenever something weird would happen in the sky, they'd run to the emperor and tell him, basically, yeah, the sky is falling. And so Jerusalem's fall is also included here. And Jewish apocalyptic literature expected them, especially before the end. So rather than going into the modern day nowadays, looking at the sky, why don't we look in history and see if there are any portents and signs in the sky that happened leading up to the fall of Jerusalem and the end of Old Covenant Israel. And lo and behold, in the third paragraph, in the 5th chapter of book 6 of the War of the Jews, Josephus' book that we talked about many times so far, there is this fascinating series of omens that foretold the fall of the temple well in advance of the beginning of the revolt. Josephus stresses the theme that this destruction was predestined. And so Josephus, looking back on these events with I guess hindsight, is able to see how these things lined up and did give a warning to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And so what I'm about to read follows immediately after Josephus' description of the burning of the temple. And it's almost like Josephus is stepping back from this awesome drama that he's been relating, and now he's putting it in the context of world history and human folly, and especially the folly of those rebels that kind of took over Jerusalem and set it on its disastrous course. And so here we go. This is Josephus, War of the Jews. Thus were the miserable people persuaded by these deceivers, and such as belied or hid or disguised God himself. And that's I want to pause there, because that's really true. Deceivers really excel, if you want to say, at disguising God. If you look at all cult leaders, all people who have been, credited as false teachers or false prophets, their modus operandi is really to veil God's true nature, isn't it? To veil his true character and ascribe things to God that aren't true of him. And then in this case, not ascribing to God things that are true also, because God is setting up, if you believe these signs that I'm about to read, God was setting up a warning for the people, and the rebels just either paid it no mention or thought it was something else, or ignored it or whatever. And so these signs plainly foretold their future desolation, but like men infatuated, without either eyes to see or minds to consider, did not regard the denunciations that God made to them. And that, for me, doesn't it echo Jesus? He who has ears, let them hear, right? What the Spirit is saying, and so on. So Josephus uses the same terminology about people not having eyes to see and not having minds to think properly. All right, so the first one is a star and a comet. And just very brief, he says, there is a star resembling a sword which stood over Jerusalem, as well as a comet that continued for a whole year. And so that's one of the signs that was going around, one of the most talked about phenomena around that time. And I guess they theorized that this was around in the 60s AD. So not, directly before the war, but in the years leading up to it, probably so that there would be plenty of time to heed the warning. That's my guess. Another one is a light around the altar. There is this, before the Jews' rebellion, before these commotions which preceded the war, Josephus writes, when the people were come in great crowds to the feast of unleavened bread on the 8th day of the month, about a week before Passover, at the 9th hour of the night, so great a light shone around the altar and the holy house that it appeared to be bright like the daytime, which lasted for half an hour. And this light seemed to be a good sign to the unskillful, but was so interpreted by the sacred scribes as to portend those events that followed immediately upon it. And so, according to this, there were sacred scribes, there were scribes and, Pharisees' allies, the people who the ordinary common Jewish folk really paid attention, as opposed to the Sadducees, which they didn't really care about, but they paid attention to their interpretation. And so you can imagine that this sign would have been, that the interpretation of it would have been spreading among the synagogues throughout the land. And
I see Father's thumbprint of love all over this. I mean, what doesn't he do to warn his people and to confirm his word, to confirm what Jesus said, and what I'm sure the early church was telling their neighbors, the people around them, we need to get out, and there's going to be certain signs and things, and they had to have been, hey, do you see this? You see, you see this sword in the sky, you see these different things going on here. Yeah, we believe this is what Jesus was talking about. It's about time to, to haul butt. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it's so interesting to me, fascinating to think of the tumult, or the how do you say, the confrontations that would have resulted from this, because Josephus describes that light, that sign, to the unskillful, which means people who are not religious teachers, they would have seen it as a good thing, like, oh, something's good's going to happen to us. But he talks about also scribes that were saying, no, this is a bad thing. And so,
Mhm.
you know, you take that for what it is. Another one is a cow gives birth to a lamb. At the same festival, also a heifer, as she was led by the high priest to be sacrificed, brought forth a lamb in the midst of the temple. Now that's weird, but we did talk though in the first uh, episode of this that mutant infants were an expectation
Mhm.
to precede, you know, historic or catastrophic events. And so, yeah, again, take this for what it is.
That would be interesting at the local county fair, wouldn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, the poor 4-H girl, or you know, the Eastern Gate. Uh, there was this Eastern Gate in the inner temple, which was made of brass and vastly heavy, Josephus writes, and had been with difficulty shut by 20 men, and rested upon a basis armed with iron, and had bolts fastened very deep into the firm floor, which was there made of one entire stone. And that gate was seen to be opened of its own accord about the 6th hour of the night. Now, those that kept watch in the temple came hereupon running to the captain of the temple and told him about it, who, when he came up and saw it, and it was not without great difficulty that he was able to shut the gate again. So, I mean, that's like what, a horror movie or something like that. You hear the
Mhm.
creaking door, you know, this massive gate swinging open. In my mind, you know, a little bit like we just finished watching Lord of the Rings, and it's like the Mordor gate, you know, with the cave
Mhm.
trolls pushing it open and whatnot. But anyways, it was just this huge, massive thing. And of course, that doesn't it bring to mind the temple curtain being torn, which is not something that is possible for human beings to do, you know, on their own. Again, another supernatural sign of something regarding the temple, which was a portent of things to come.
Yeah, no strongman competition competitors would have been able to rip that veil.
Right.
Yeah,
Exactly. Um, sorry, I don't know if I just winked out there. Sorry, guys.
you're all right.
Uh, you know, Josephus continues. He says this also appeared to the vulgar or common people to be a very happy sign, a very happy prodigy. Everybody's like, "Yay!" As if God did thereby open to them the gate of happiness. That's an interesting interpretation.
Mm.
But the men of learning understood it that the security of their holy house was dissolved of its own accord. So they saw it as a breach of security. Interesting, eh? And that the gate was opened for the advantage of their enemies. You know, similar to, I don't know, maybe Hezekiah opening the gate for the, was it the Babylonians or Assyrians in order
Mm.
to inspect the temple treasury?
I have to double check that one.
Yeah. So these publicly declared that the signal foreshadowed the desolation that was coming upon them. Now, I guess it's worth mentioning that it could be both and not either or, because if you think about the temple curtain being torn in two, that was like it was a happy thing for those that had an expectation of a new kingdom, of a new covenant. Like God, like Elvis had left the building, God left the building,
Mm.
and so it was no longer up to people to go and find God in the temple or do a bunch of stuff in order to earn His favor or his absolution for their sins, but rather now God was coming upon all of humanity,
And
pouring
and
himself out
and
upon
that
humanity.
temple, yeah, that temple never experienced the glory of Solomon's temple. So this was the most glorious thing to happen. God's, he's like, I'm out of here. And
Right.
it was like he was resting, which we know he's omnipresent, but just for our sake, as far as
Yeah.
where he is known to dwell with man, he's
Right.
just chilling out. The Romans are running rampant, for lack of a better term. All hell is breaking loose, and then Jesus shows up on the scene. It is finished, and then you know God, he's like, I'm out of here now. This
Yeah,
is
man.
it.
Yeah.
This is the new thing, the new day. This is my
Yeah.
son.
Like,
This is Israel. Jacob is gone. Here's Israel for good. And the watch the Commonwealth of Israel, thrive from this point on. It's, this divine moment. I mean, man, it's just
it,
really something to think about from God's perspective,
yeah, it's like Clark Kent, ripping his tie and suit off, and then
Yeah.
Superman bursting out
Mm-hmm.
And he's supernatural. He can do miracles. He can help. He can save and rescue people and destroy enemies and stuff like that. So, anyways, I do, now that I'm reading this again, and it's good to, during the recording, just let off whatever things come into your mind. But for me now, I can see that this was definitely both, and it was definitely good news that this gate opened up again, signifying God's exit and entering into the world, exit of the temple and entering into the world.
The
But
new
also,
heaven and the new earth that we're going
right.
to be talking
But
about.
then
Yes.
but then make no mistake, it is a breach of security. It is a bad news. And maybe the religious lawyers and the teachers of the law that went around probably in the countryside preaching this in their synagogues, like, guess what happened in Jerusalem yesterday? They would have been telling the people that this was this was a sign of a desolation.
Yes.
And so, but of course, many paid it no heed. But those that did, what a confirmation this would have been to the Christians, I guess. Hey, Joe, like around that time. Hey, remember when Jesus was talking about, these portents and signs?
Yeah.
This could be one of them. Yeah.
Yeah. And one side is like they're thinking, well, the Messiah wants in here, and God himself is saying, I want out of here.
Mm,
Yeah.
okay. Yeah, right. Because yeah, it was the Eastern Gate, which was the gate that was prophesied. Wasn't it the Eastern Gate that the Messiah was supposed to enter?
Mm-hmm.
So Josephus doesn't mention anything about that, but it could have been very misconstrued. You're right. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I believe that's right. Yeah.
So the other one is a miraculous phenomenon of chariots in the sky. So here we go. Besides these, a few days after that feast, on the 21st day of the month Artemisius, which is, I guess, May or June, a certain prodigious and incredible phenomenon appeared. I suppose the account of it would seem to be a fable or like a myth, were it not related by those who saw it, and were not the events that followed it of so considerable a nature as to deserve such signals. For before the sun set, chariots and troops of soldiers in their armor were seen running about among the clouds and surrounding cities. That's amazing. Like, you can almost see the signs now becoming more, instead of a hazy kind of photograph, now they're like sharp focus and image. Like, there's some military stuff, militancy is coming upon this place, as if God is like, let's not make this blurry anymore. Let's give them a movie of what's actually going to happen.
And I love that we have a guy like Josephus who didn't have a dog in the fight. He wasn't a Christian apologist,
Okay.
He just a journalist, a reporter saying what is happening, and
Right.
which substantiates what we're talking about today. So just the purity of, what he shared, again, not having a dog in the fight. And if he did have one, I don't know that he may not have been leaning in the other direction, as far as what he would have reported. Yeah.
Yeah. At first, yeah, he would have definitely been for the defense of Israel and let's bunker up and everything. But I guess later on, he definitely saw the error of his ways, and is again. We don't want to commit the genetic fallacy that just because someone was a turncoat to the nation of Israel and changed sides, does that automatically mean everything that he witnessed or saw is in doubt? I don't think so. I think, again, this is a case of it's a great treasure that we have a first century eyewitness who is speaking about these things. And you can even take out from the way he words things the flavor of pandering to the Romans. It's easy to see where he does that. He panders to the Romans because he's in survival mode. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But you can take that out. You can desaturate, you might say, his language, and you can see that what remains is there's a lot of really good historic truth that measures up.
Yeah. And I'm not comparing I am comparing apples to oranges with this one, but I'm sure that, guys like the prophet Jeremiah were considered traitors in their day with the things that they were prophesying. It sounded like they were on the enemy's side.
True. That's true also. Yeah. And so, yeah, so a few more. There's the sounds of a great multitude. Moreover, at that feast, which we call Pentecost, as the priests were going by night into the inner court of the temple, as their custom was to perform their sacred ministry, they said that in the first place, they felt this quaking. And then they heard this great noise. And after that, they heard a sound as of a great multitude saying, "Let us remove hence." Now that one is really intriguing to me because there are some places in the Bible where sounds of a great multitude also occurred. And if you remember, the first one was, and all of them had to do with instituting covenants, by the way. So the first one was on Mount Sinai, where Sinai was not just smoking, but it said it was quaking. It also said there was thunder and lightning. But I looked at the Hebrew of that, and there's a great message about this that I'd like to share one day. But anyways, they didn't really have in Hebrew the word for thunder, so they used the word for voices. So if you look at the original underlying text, it's like on Sinai, there was these great voices, sounding voices here and there and everywhere. And this, as if this great conversation was happening around Moses and God having their meeting, on Mount
Mm-hmm.
Sinai. And what was that but the institution of the old covenant, the first covenant that Israel as a people was supposed to have corporately, where everyone was going to be the priest and so on. And so there's a link between that and Pentecost, which is the other one that we know about more commonly. We know about in the upper room when there was the fire and the tongues of fire, and people began speaking and having this conversation in different languages, which is really parallel to what happened on Mount Sinai. So tongues is not just this new inexplicable phenomenon, this sign that happened out of nowhere. No, that had an amazing precedent on Mount Sinai. But again, the point, I guess, is that each of these things is a sign of the beginning of something. It's a birth pang of something.
And look at the
Something is going to happen.
parallel there too when Paul talks about, in Galatians and in Hebrews, where we've come onto Mount Zion, and he
Mm.
parallels it to Sinai.
And now you bring that into what Josephus records here, which is the sound of this great multitude in the inner court of the temple, which is amazing.
Mhm.
And again, quaking, great noise, sound of a great multitude. But this time, the multitude, what they said was, "Let's get out of here."
Mhm.
So again, he's bringing it into sharp focus. The voices are not unintelligible. Like, for example, when Paul, heard the voice and only he could hear it, but the rest of the crowd all we heard was this thunder. But in this case, apparently everyone within earshot heard this saying, "Let's remove hence." In other words, let's get the heck out of here. And so again,
Mhm.
he's vacated the temple for something much, much better, for a new covenant of freedom and worldwide influence. So
I wonder if the original hearers were thinking, in terms of Sinai and perhaps the new Zion and the during that time, depending on the audience. It's really interesting. Sometimes I just like to think and
yeah.
imagine what were they going through, what was on either side of this, the believers and then those who, what were the Pharisees, the Sadducees, priests, different ones thinking when all of this was going on. And I think there was really, just it was parallel thought patterns that were happening. Yeah.
I mean, there have been fictional novels written about this period. I'm not sure if they included these signs, but in the 1800s, in the 19th century, there were quite a few novels about the fall of Jerusalem. And sadly, in our century, 20th and 21st, not hardly any at all. And like we talked about earlier, wouldn't you love to see a film version or a TV series, that goes into this stuff
Yeah,
and just makes it, crystal clear? It'd be so cool to watch that. Yeah.
absolutely.
Um, the last one is something that we've talked about in the past, which is Jesus, the son of Ananias, the voice from the east. Now, this can also be counted as a sign, not of course in the clouds or in the heavens or whatnot, but it was again a God repeating himself and bringing into sharp focus uh, the word of warning, I guess, the prophecy of warning in order to bring to Jerusalem. And so,
Mhm.
whereas you can almost see in these signs, it's going from a very blurry or hazy to a very sharp focus. And what is sharper than a man, a flesh and blood man, coming to you in your face, giving a cry like a voice from the east, a voice from the west, a voice from the four winds, a voice against Jerusalem and the holy house, a voice against the bridegrooms and the brides, and a voice against this whole people, or you might say this whole generation. And uh, and not only is he flesh and blood, but his name is Jesus. Like,
Mm.
so so you know,
Yeah.
you got to think about that. This was 4 years before the war began. He was just a common guy, a livestock herder or husbandman, he's called.
Hmm.
And when the city was in great peace and prosperity, he began to cry aloud what I just read.
Mm.
Um,
Awesome.
Day and night, he went about in all the lanes of the city. And just let's get into story mode, because I love this part of Josephus. Bring yourself, imagine you're in Jerusalem hearing this, and what was the reaction of the people. Just have a listen to this. However, certain of the most eminent among the populace had great indignation at this dire cry of his, okay? And they took up the man, and they gave him a great number of severe stripes. Does that ring a bell to you?
Yeah.
Yet Yet did not he either say anything for himself. In other words, he was dumb, silent as a
Hmm.
lamb, you might say.
Before shearers, sure.
Yeah. Or anything peculiar to those that chastised him, but still went on with the same words which he cried before. Hereupon the magistrates, supposing as the case proved to be that this was a sort of divine fury in the man, that's a really interesting phrase. They brought the guy before the Roman procurator, where he was whipped till his bones were laid bare. Poor guy. Yet he didn't make any supplication for himself, nor did he shed any tears, but turning his voice to the most lamentable tone possible, at every stroke of the whip, his answer was the same: Woe, woe to Jerusalem. Wow.
Mm.
And when Albinus, for he was then our procurator, asked him, and by the way, because Albinus is there, you can get the time reference there. So it would have been in the early to mid 60s. They asked the guy who he was and where did you come from and why are you saying these words? And Jesus, son of Ananias, he made no manner of reply to what was said, but still didn't leave off his melancholy ditty till
Mm.
Albinus took him to be a madman and just let him go. So that's, I guess, in contradiction to what happened to Jesus. They didn't let him go, but in this case, they let this Jesus go. Now, during all the time that passed before the war began, this man didn't go near any of the citizens, nor was seen by them while he said so, but he every day uttered these lamentable words, as if it were his premeditated vow: Woe, woe to Jerusalem. Nor did he give ill words to any of those that beat him every day, nor good words to those that gave him food. But this was his reply to all men. In other words, he's not saying anything else but this. He just has one mission.
Mm-hmm.
And this cry of his was the loudest during the festivals. Because you can imagine, yeah, the population of Jerusalem would have been swollen during that time. More people would have been around. And so the cry was louder, apparently. And he continued this way for 7 years and 5 months without growing hoarse or being tired, until the very time that he saw his presage, prophecy in earnest fulfilled in our siege, the siege of Jerusalem, when he stopped. Because as he was going around upon the wall, he cried out with his utmost force, Woe, woe to the city again, and to the people, and to the holy house. And just as he added at the last, Woe, woe to myself, also there came this stone out of the Roman catapult, siege engines, and smote him and killed him immediately. And as he was uttering the very same thing, he gave up the ghost. And that is the unfortunate end of our friend Jesus, of son of Ananias.
Good stuff.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot here. There's a lot of warning, like you said, a sign of love. These are These are things that God wants to use to make sure as many get out alive as possible. These
Yeah.
tales, apparently circulated among the Jews after the war. They're collected by Josephus,
Hmm.
and they show the need of the populace to make sense of the destruction, as
Yeah.
well as Josephus' own interest in prophecy. And of course, Josephus is writing this to his non-Jewish readers, and he's kind of making sure that the Romans know the temple and the city were not burned at your whim. It's not just because of you that the temple and the city are gone,
It's
but it
good.
was a kind of destiny. It was destroyed by a greater force. It was destined to happen by a force that, of course, Josephus doesn't know the main purpose about why, but
Yeah.
he does recognize that it's part of God's plan.
Yeah, man, you could spend days and months with the man with with the
Yeah.
Sinai Zion parallel that we were talking about. We could talk about that verse for ages. It's just amazing. Yeah, love it.
Joe, I have one more thing which I just learned about today. I don't know why this escaped me, but just at the tail end to finish off this chapter in Josephus, there's a really weird additional prophecy that's recorded. I don't know if you've heard of this before,
Maybe
but
not. Hit me. Yeah, hit me.
it's another mysterious warning, the source of which is completely unknown today. Nobody knows where this prophecy came from, but it's a prophecy of the square temple.
Ha. Nope,
And it
never heard
goes
that
like
one.
this.
Yeah.
Okay, so it goes like this. Now, if this is also from Josephus, The Wars of the Jews. Now, if anyone consider these things, he'll find that God takes care of mankind and by all ways possible foreshadows to our race what is for their preservation. It's a
Mhm.
beautiful line.
Mhm.
But that men perish by those miseries which they madly and voluntarily bring upon themselves. For the Jews, by demolishing the tower of Antonia, the fortress of Antonia, which we talked about in a previous podcast, they wanted to remove the Roman garrison that was lodging there near the temple. So they demolished it, they destroyed it. But the Jews, by doing that, Josephus says, made their temple four square. Now each side is symmetrical. It doesn't have that jutting out part, the fortress of Antonia kind of hanging off the front end. It made the temple perfectly square, while at the same time they had it written in their sacred oracles. So this was apparently a prophecy that was written beforehand, and it went like this: that then should their city be taken, as well as their holy house, when once their temple should become foursquare. So we'll leave that there. That's pretty
Ha.
amazing to me.
I never heard that
And
part to put two and two together. That's very interesting. Sure.
And so I love what Josephus says. Of course, it's unfortunate, but it's just very compelling that Josephus describes the Jews, and he's not talking about as a race, but those rebels that were wanted to take God's messianic clock and wanted to take the messianic timetable into their own hands and begin to, with violence, initiate a new age or a new covenant or whatever. They actually fulfilled a prophecy against themselves. That's kind of what he's saying there.
Wow.
Do we have time to go on, or shall we?
We do. I'm gonna say yes. Yeah.
So the only other thing I wanted
Why
to
not?
bring
The
up,
worst the listeners and viewers can do is pause it and listen to the rest later. Yeah. Let's roll.
Yeah, I mean, just the last thing is, why don't we take on the end of this episode the powers were shaken, and this is both in Matthew and in Luke. Talks about this. What does it mean that the powers were shaken? What was going on historically during that time, not just in Judea, but in other parts of the world? So history tells us that the world after Jesus was crucified was a world in turmoil.
Roman Empire
Of
was
course,
pretty nuts when I just watched a documentary not long ago on Vespasian, and I was like,
oh yeah,
mind blown
right.
about that guy alone. Yeah, just crazy the way he kind of came up from very humble beginnings, and
Mhm.
just the things that transpired, pretty wild.
Right, and just in the middle of the siege of Jerusalem, or just before the siege of Jerusalem, the reason Vespasian left the battlefield and gave it over to his son, as you probably saw in the documentary, is because there was not a vacant throne, but a very contested throne.
Hmm.
After Nero died, a whole bunch of people wanted in on it, and
Yeah.
so there was
And
quite a bit of
Galba, I mean, they're just some different
yeah.
characters and different things, just a different dynamic was happening in the Roman Empire at that time for sure.
So yeah, great internal disorder, like you said, continual changes of its rulers. I think there was even a suicide in the middle of that.
Mm.
Um, and they understood that every part of the habitable earth under them was in an unsettled and tottering condition, Josephus describes. It was marked by wars in Rome. For example, Vitellius bringing an army from Germany into Rome and taking over the government. Vespasian and Titus in Galilee and Judea. Remember the Idumeans against the Jews, nation against nation. The Zealots now, faction against faction, the Zealots against the ruling Sanhedrin and the people. Then we have the Sicarii, which are related. They're like these bandits with these curved daggers,
Are you
which were
telling
like
me that there were wars and rumors of wars in the first century? Is that what you're getting at?
yeah, go figure. It's like
Really?
Jesus knew something, you know? Yeah,
Imagine that.
yeah. Yeah, these Sicarii were against everybody. There was an uprising in Gaul happening fairly simultaneously. The Syrians were scheming against the Jews. We talked about this genocidal pattern that happened town to town against Jews, and then Jews would take revenge and going to another town and just killing Gentiles. The Scythians or Sarmatians invading the borders along Germany. Scythians plundering Media. The Celtae revolting. Go figure. The Celts, warlike people, yeah. Those beyond the Euphrates warring, which is the very boundary of the Roman Empire, etc., etc., etc. So if you want to talk about powers shaking, earth quaking during that time, I
Hmm.
think it's hard to beat first century, mid first century. That was a pretty, that time was, fit fairly, very, very well. The prophetic imagery and
Yeah.
prophetic language that's being used there. So yeah, that's what I
Yes.
have.
Wonderful. Yeah. And those Celtic people were really cool. I, not long ago, read a book about Celtic evangelism and what they did through ministries of hospitality. It was just a combination of hospitality and monasticism that really worked well. Yeah. So,
Wow.
just something that, yeah, I looked at that and it was like, there were a lot of parallels to what was happening with the first century church. Not that they were monastic, but just the way that they were doing things, and the enemy love and taking in outsiders. And it was just really, really cool history. Yeah.
Wow. That sounds really good.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. I'll have to throw that reference up somewhere, that book. I got it on Amazon. So I'll throw the link up somewhere for.
does it talk about Saint Patrick, or is that part
Yeah,
of that?
yeah. Patrick's
Okay.
in there, and there's a whole, yeah. There's really, it's neat. It's really, it opened my eyes to some things that I had absolutely never seen. A friend of mine, yeah, recommended the book, and it was top notch as far as I'm concerned. Sure, yeah.
Cool.
So do we, man? I am so, yeah. I'm chafing at the bit here to to move forward, but that was good. We've been about an hour and a half on that, and so we
Oh wow.
can, yeah. I guess we'll pick up with verse 30 next time.
So you're telling me we only got through one verse?
That's kind of what I'm telling. Yeah, well, part of it was my fault. I got excited and we started talking about everything. Yeah, on the face of the earth. Yeah,
Well,
but
I hope the people listening don't mind. I hope they really got something today, because man, I enjoyed it. I enjoy
well,
studying not only history but seeing the words of Scripture kind of become alive before my eyes
yeah,
in its original context. Which is
yeah,
not to say that it is, we need to be ignorant of its applications now, but
sure.
it's, like you said, it's very comforting to know that these portents and signs in the sky
Yeah.
are not ahead of us so much as they are behind us, and that
Yes.
we now live in the new messianic, brilliant, glorious age that all
Yes.
Jews were hoping and waiting for in great expectation.
Yeah.
What a time to be living right now, even during COVID, man. Yeah.
Yeah. And some things I don't look for them to ever repeat themselves, although I can apply some wisdom from what I learned from it. Like I don't, as far as 666, Neron Kaiser. So there's a lot of things I read about in the book of Revelation. I read in Matthew 24, Second Thessalonians, and so on and so forth. That I'm like, this is there's no way that this is going to happen again. These are, one time, one and done events. But yes, we can learn from them, especially through I believe through the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount. Especially we look at those things, and this was the lifestyle. And when we read Acts and how when they went through times of war and political upheaval, although I don't have to look for those same exact things that Jesus spoke about, but when there's things as let's say, as the earth is not perfect yet, but as things are progressing and his kingdom is coming, his will is being done on earth as it is in heaven, I can look at these things. I can look at the way, Jesus through John admonished the seven churches of Asia. I can see political systems, like what's going on, Roman Empire, what empires are going on in the world today, and how do I behave, what's my behavior in the midst of empire. And I can rule and reign with the Lamb in his upside down love kingdom right now, and manifest that kingdom. What's going on with religion and that type of thing. How do I not be entangled and ensnared by that? So there's all of these things. Again, although I believe there's certain things that were a one and done, but you can always look and say, hey, this is how this applies today. This is what the Roman Empire was doing. This is what Jesus thought about it. And this is how they ruled and reigned in the midst of it, and so often in the kingdom of God, you look like the loser, but you're winning the whole time, and in the end, I mean, we obviously have the ultimate victory through the finished work of Christ. Yeah.
Can't agree with you more, man. Yeah, that's awesome. Let's get this message out there, to as many people as possible. And while we're not dogmatic about anything that we say here, our motivation is freedom, right? And love and unrestricted, and how would you say, like an unrestricted view of prophecy, where it's freeing and it's for a future that is brilliant. It's for a brilliant future, an optimistic future, for sure.
Yes. Don't confuse my my passion and my excitement with dogma. It's just no. I so much 54 years old want to remain teachable, because I'm always learning things. The Foursquare thing you brought up, there's a new thing.
Me too.
I can have a conversation with a third grader and learn a new thing, every single day, and the Lord just reveal his beauty through things. So absolutely. But the biggest thing to me is, the biggest takeaway is not to be fearful. You are victorious. You don't have to be looking for all kind of signs. Jesus is your sign, and we are the children of the kingdom, are to be signs and wonders in the earth. We are now to be those signs and the wonders, and the light of the world, light of the world, not sun, moon, and stars, but Jesus through us, the light of the world. So be encouraged. You have anything before we close?
I just want to say, I love how you brought it back, like circular to the beginning, talking about lights and stuff. That's such a great note to end on. And I hope people are really encouraged, that just like Jesus said, don't hide your light. Don't hide what you carry. Go out in the anointing that God has given you, because you have a green light from heaven. You want to talk about lights? It's a green light, man.
Absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely. All right. Love you, brother. Thanks again for hanging out with me for a little while on a Wednesday evening.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah.
All right. To all our viewers, listeners, man, we love you so much. Have a wonderful week. Can't wait to dig into the rest of this chapter. We plan to be back with, looks like verse 30 next week. So Have a great one.